Picture America in 1943. While young men stormed beaches in Europe and the Pacific, Frank Sinatra was creating a different kind of chaos on American soil, causing riots of screaming teenage girls outside the Paramount Theater. To most Americans, he was just an impossibly skinny crooner with a voice that made Bobby Soxers faint. But to J. Edgar Hoover, the most powerful lawman in American history, Frank Sinatra represented something far more dangerous. Tonight, we explore how one man's 40-year obsession with surveillance would create the most extensive FBI file on any entertainer in American history. A file that reveals not just Sinatra's secrets, but the price of being both a cultural icon and a perpetual suspect in your own country. The file began innocently enough, as so many governmental obsessions do. In March 1943, a 28-year-old Frank Sinatra was riding the crest of an unprecedented wave of popularity. His performances at the Paramount Theater in New York had caused what newspapers called mass hysteria, thousands of teenage girls screaming, fainting, mobbing the stage door. To understand why this mattered to the FBI, one must understand the America of that era. This was a nation at war, a nation where conformity was patriotism and deviation from the norm attracted immediate suspicion. Frank's meteoric rise had happened almost overnight. Just 3 years earlier, he'd been singing with Tommy Dorsey's band, talented but anonymous. Then came the solo career, the Columbus Day riot at the Paramount, and suddenly Frank Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He was a phenomenon that older Americans couldn't comprehend. When teenage girls stopped attending school to camp outside his hotel, when they rushed the stage and tore at his clothes, when they broke through police barricades and caused what amounted to civil disturbances, the establishment took notice. And in 1940s America, the establishment's eyes were J. Edgar Hoover's eyes. The director of the FBI had built his reputation on protecting America from perceived threats. He'd started with gangsters in the 1930s, then communists, and by 1943, his paranoia had evolved into a sophisticated surveillance apparatus that monitored anyone who might, in his estimation, pose a threat to American values. To Hoover's calculating mind, a skinny Italian singer who could mobilize thousands of young Americans with his voice represented a form of power that needed monitoring. What if that power could be weaponized? What if Sinatra was a communist agitator using music as propaganda? What if his appeal to America's youth was part of some larger conspiracy? The official trigger for opening the Sinatra file came from an unexpected source. In late 1943, Lee Mortimer, a conservative columnist for the New York Daily Mirror, began writing articles questioning Sinatra's patriotism. Why wasn't this healthy young man in uniform like other able-bodied Americans? Sinatra had been classified 4F due to a punctured eardrum, but to men like Mortimer, any healthy-looking male civilian was a suspect. The columns implied cowardice, suggested draft dodging, and hinted at un-American sympathies. Mortimer's articles found their way to Hoover's desk, and the FBI director, always attentive to public opinion and the potential for scandal, made a decision that would shadow Sinatra for the rest of his life. He opened a file. What began as a routine background check quickly metastasized into something far more comprehensive. FBI agents attended Sinatra's concerts, noting the demographics of the crowds, the content of his between-song banter, any comments that might suggest communist sympathies. They interviewed his neighbors in New Jersey, questioning whether he displayed American flags, whether he spoke critically of the war effort, whether his visitors seemed suspicious. They examined his charitable work. Was his support for Italian-American causes actually coded support for Mussolini? They scrutinized his friendships. Who was this Hank Sanicola character always at his side? What about those New Jersey politicians who seemed so eager to be photographed with the young singer? For those who remember the 1940s, this level of governmental intrusion might seem unthinkable today. But in that era, the FBI operated with virtually no oversight. Hoover had cultivated relationships with presidents and congressmen through a simple formula. He kept files on everyone, and everyone knew he kept files. This created a climate where challenging the FBI director was tantamount to inviting investigation. Even presidents feared him. Frank Sinatra, at 28, had no idea he was now caught in J. Edgar Hoover's web. The file grew thicker throughout the 1940s, but its true purpose became clear in February 1947. Sinatra, now at the absolute peak of his Bobby Soxer fame, made what would prove to be a catastrophic decision for his FBI file. He traveled to Havana, Cuba. What happened during those 4 days in February would haunt him for decades and provide the FBI with what they considered their smoking gun against Sinatra. Cuba in 1947 was a paradise for American mobsters. With Batista in power and revolution still a decade away, Havana had become the mob's offshore headquarters, a place where men who couldn't meet openly in New York or Chicago could gather without fear of immediate federal surveillance. In February 1947, nearly every major American crime boss had gathered at the Hotel Nacional for what the FBI would later call the Havana Conference. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and dozens of others. These men were supposed to be Hoover's primary targets, the criminals who justified the FBI's existence. Instead, the FBI's attention became fixed on the singer who flew down to entertain them. According to the FBI files that would eventually be partially declassified, Frank Sinatra arrived in Havana on February 11, 1947, carrying a suitcase. The Bureau's Cuban informants reported that the suitcase allegedly contained $2 million in cash. Payment, they suggested, for Luciano's role in helping the military with dock security during the war, or perhaps an investment in Cuban casinos. To this day, what was actually in that suitcase remains disputed. Sinatra always maintained he'd simply come to vacation and perhaps sing a few songs for friends. The FBI believed they documented proof of direct mob participation. What cannot be disputed is that Frank Sinatra, the voice that made American teenagers swoon, spent 4 days socializing with men who had ordered murders, run prostitution rings, and corrupted entire city governments. The FBI files document dinners at the Hotel Nacional, late-night visits to the Sans Souci nightclub, photographs taken by Bureau informants showing Sinatra laughing with Lucky Luciano, America's most notorious deported gangster. For J. Edgar Hoover, this was validation of his initial instinct. This singer was dirty, and now there was proof. The Havana trip represented the second paradox that would define Sinatra's life. He was becoming America's romantic voice, the singer who expressed love more beautifully than anyone before or since. Yet he maintained relationships with men who represented everything America officially opposed. Those who lived through the 1950s remember how this contradiction created a peculiar cognitive dissonance. How could the same man who sang "I've Got You Under My Skin" with such tender vulnerability also be the man photographed shaking hands with Lucky Luciano? The FBI files reveal Hoover's strategy. Keep building the file, wait for the right political moment, then destroy Sinatra's career when it served the Bureau's purposes. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, as Frank's career hit its lowest point, as Ava Gardner consumed his heart, as Columbia Records dropped him, As Hollywood seemed finished with him, the FBI kept watching. They monitored his divorce from Nancy, documented his volatile relationship with Ava, noted every public altercation, every late-night call to Ava's hotel room. The file grew to include not just alleged criminal associations, but intimate details of his romantic devastation. Here, the paradoxes converged in ways that make Sinatra's story uniquely American and uniquely tragic. He was the chairman, the man who would soon command presidents and control Las Vegas, yet he was simultaneously powerless to stop his own government from documenting his heartbreak. FBI wiretaps captured him calling Ava drunk at 3 a.m, begging her to come back. Surveillance reports noted his weight loss, his depression, his public confrontations with photographers who wouldn't stop capturing his misery. The same files that documented alleged mob meetings also documented the self-destruction of a man who'd lost the only woman he ever truly loved. The surveillance intensified dramatically in 1960 when Sinatra threw himself into John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. For Frank, this was redemption, his chance to prove he was as American as anyone, to demonstrate his patriotism by helping elect a president. He organized fundraisers, convinced other entertainers to participate, used his considerable influence to mobilize votes. He even rewrote High Hopes as Kennedy's campaign song. When Kennedy won, Frank believed his government would finally see him as the patriot he'd always insisted he was. Instead, the FBI saw a dangerous convergence of power. Their files documented Sinatra's connections to Sam Giancana, the Chicago outfit boss, who'd allegedly helped deliver Illinois to Kennedy through carefully managed vote counting in Chicago precincts. The Bureau believed Sinatra was the bridge between America's president and its organized crime syndicates, not a patriot helping his country, but a mob intermediary positioning himself at the nexus of political power. To J. Edgar Hoover, whose paranoia by 1960 had reached almost pathological levels, Sinatra represented an existential threat to proper American order. The breaking point came in 1963 with Cal-Neva Lodge. Frank had built this Lake Tahoe resort into a glittering showplace where the Rat Pack performed and Hollywood's elite vacationed. But Sam Giancana kept visiting, and the FBI kept watching. And Nevada gaming regulations explicitly prohibited licensed casino owners from associating with known criminals. The Bureau's surveillance of Cal-Neva became almost comically extensive. Hidden microphones in the casino, informants among the staff, agents photographing everyone who entered and left. They were building toward something, and Frank, blinded by his own sense of power, didn't see it coming until too late. In September 1963, the Nevada Gaming Control Board, acting on FBI information, announced they were investigating Giancana's presence at Cal-Neva. Frank, displaying the volcanic temper that the FBI had documented for 2 decades, made the catastrophic mistake of confronting gaming board chairman Ed Olson. The phone call, partially recorded, revealed a Sinatra stripped of all diplomatic pretense. He allegedly told Olson to go to hell, that he didn't need the gaming license, that they could all go screw themselves. Within weeks, Nevada revoked his gaming license, forcing him to divest his interest in Cal-Neva and the Sands. The FBI files from this period reveal something chilling: satisfaction. Bureau memos discuss the Cal-Neva situation with barely concealed pleasure. After 20 years of surveillance, they'd finally gotten him. The American icon who'd rubbed shoulders with presidents was now barred from owning casinos in Nevada, his mob connections no longer deniable, his power in Las Vegas effectively broken. J. Edgar Hoover had won, But the file didn't close. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, even as Sinatra's career experienced multiple renaissances, even as he married Barbara and found a measure of peace, the FBI kept watching. They monitored his political shift from Democrat to Republican, his friendship with Ronald Reagan, his organizational role in Reagan's 1981 inauguration. They tracked his continuing friendships with mob-connected figures, his business dealings, his charitable work. The surveillance became routine, automatic, almost bureaucratic, no longer driven by Hoover's personal paranoia after the director's death in 1972, but continuing because that's what bureaucracies do. They maintain files, they keep watching. The complete FBI file on Frank Sinatra, partially released through Freedom of Information Act requests after his death, runs to 2,403 pages. Those who've read the unredacted portions describe a document that is simultaneously revealing and absurd, meticulous and paranoid. Proof of both genuine mob connections and governmental overreach that bordered on persecution. The file documents real crimes, wiretapped conversations proving Sinatra knew exactly who his mob friends were and what they did. But it also documents trivia that reveals the investigation's obsessive nature. What Frank ordered for dinner at Jilly's, what he said to a cigarette girl at the Sands, how many drinks he consumed on a Tuesday night in 1967. What the FBI files ultimately reveal is not just Frank Sinatra's complicated relationship with power and criminality, but something deeper about American celebrity in the 20th century. Sinatra lived his entire adult life knowing he was being watched, knowing that every phone call might be monitored, every meeting documented, every indiscretion catalogued. This knowledge shaped him in ways both obvious and subtle. It made him more defiant, more volatile, more determined to live by his own code precisely because his government refused to acknowledge any code but their own. Those who knew him in his later years spoke of a man who assumed every room was bugged, who chose his words carefully on phones, who lived with the constant awareness that someone, somewhere, was taking notes. The paradox that defined Sinatra's relationship with the FBI, the American icon who was simultaneously America's most surveilled entertainer, reflected a larger truth about post-war American life. The same country that celebrated individual freedom also built the most extensive domestic surveillance apparatus in the democratic world. The same government that promoted Frank Sinatra abroad as proof of American cultural supremacy also maintained a file that could destroy him if they chose. He was both celebrated and suspect, both patriot and security risk, both quintessentially American and somehow foreign to American official culture. In 1998, when Frank Sinatra died at 82, the FBI file finally stopped growing. By then, it was an artifact of 20th century paranoia, a document that said more about J. Edgar Hoover's America than it did about Francis Albert Sinatra. Presidents sent condolences. World leaders issued statements. The Pope acknowledged his passing. And somewhere in an FBI records facility, a 403-page file sat in storage. Testament to 40 years of surveillance that had documented everything about Sinatra except the one thing that truly mattered, what it was in his voice that moved the human heart. For those who remember when being watched by your government was a mark of suspicion rather than routine, Sinatra's FBI file represents something important. It reminds us that power flows in multiple directions, that a government can watch a man his entire life, document his every mistake, prove his connections to criminals, revoke his licenses and threaten his career, and still not diminish what made him matter. They could surveil Frank Sinatra, but they couldn't stop millions of people from loving his music, couldn't prevent his voice from defining American romance, couldn't erase the fact that when he sang in the wee small hours of the morning, he was expressing something true about the human condition that no FBI file could capture or contain. The file is closed now. The man is gone. But the voice remains, untouched by surveillance, unbowed by governmental obsession, still singing the songs that made teenage girls scream in 1943 and still move hearts today. J. Edgar Hoover built a 2,403-page file, and Frank Sinatra built a legacy. History remembers which mattered more,